Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national broadcaster Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and key strategic partnerships of India with important countries that have a bearing on India's rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are looking at new and emerging dimensions in India's most important strategic partnership with the United States. The US-India Comprehensive Global Strategic Partnership has been flourishing over the years, but there are new dimensions that have emerged in it, and it promises to be truly a defining partnership that will remake the world order in the 21st century. So we're going to be talking about all these emerging aspects and what more India and the United States together can do for prosperity and for security in the world. And to discuss this, I'm really privileged to introduce you to a domain expert from the US who's with me in the studio, Richard Rossow. Richard Rossow is chair of US-India Policy Studies at one of the most important think tanks in the United States, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. He is a seasoned India expert and has been working on economic and security aspects relating to US-India cooperation for more than 2 decades. And it's a real honor for us to have you with us, Rick. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Rick, this is, we say, every leader says this is the most defining partnership of the 21st century. And progressively, you've seen over the last 2 decades how it has, reached a certain high point. And now the question really is, which are the areas where you think we are really, the relationship is blooming? Why is it happening? And let's start with the economic aspect, because you've been studying it very closely. And we have now bilateral trade of close to $200 billion per annum. And the US is de facto the largest foreign investor in India, although Singapore and Mauritius are often mentioned as 1 and 2. But in terms of foreign capital coming into India, the US is the biggest. So in many ways, it's our most important economic partner, technology partner. There's no question that US-India economic relationship benefits average Indians in a very concrete way. So let's talk about this relation, the economic part to start with, and how do you see it going, and what are the exciting new avenues for this?
Yeah, well, we've had, I think, multiple stages when you look at US-India commercial integration. I mean, you're right. From Delhi's perspective, the United States is India's largest trade partner, if you include goods and services, the largest foreign investment partner, a key constituent, too, for investing in areas like IT-enabled services. From Washington's standpoint, India, I would say, is a rising part of our economic portfolio looking globally. It's now one of our 10 largest trading partners. And again, if any company has got offshore R&D and IT, it's probably coming first to places like Bangalore and Hyderabad. And there actually is an increasing level of Indian investment in the United States. So we are clearly India's top economic partner, and India is a rising economic partner to the United States. But again, the economic partnership has developed, I would say, kind of in waves. I mean, with the not much, of course, before the 1991 economic reforms. When the 91 reforms began, one of the first big areas was grid-scale power generation. A lot of excitement from companies like Enron, if we remember that. Not all that worked out quite as well. But about 25 years ago is when the first real and the most important part of the economic relationship began to blossom, which was the connectivity with IT services. India sometimes talks about hoping to replicate China's work as the manufacturing workshop of the world. But let's all recognize India already is that when you talk about high-end areas like research and IT services. So there's a great part of the global economy at the high end that India's already captured the lion's share of, which is very exciting. Now I think the mission is to try to see if we can supplement that by better connectivity on trade, by manufacturing, and it is very much a two-way street, and that is extremely high on the two governments' agenda right now. So the economic relationship, it's strong, it's growing, and we know the areas we need to move into most effectively right now.
Yeah. Rick, definitely services trade is booming, and India has actually trade deficits with most countries, but it has a surplus with the US thanks to services trade especially. But manufacturing, I mean, because we have this large and growing young population, questions about employing them, and there's no doubt that we will need, if not replicate China, do something else, but on the basis of manufacturing, it cannot be simply bypassed as we grow, right? So for India's growth to become a $10 trillion, $20 trillion, the projection that we'll become a $50 trillion economy in the next 2 decades, equal to China and the US. So that kind of a scenario, for it to happen, we will very much need American technology and American investments, right? And Prime Minister Narendra Modi has always been emphasizing this. Every time he's in the US, he meets the top CEOs, and there are certain very new areas in which we are also, which are more strategic. And I'd like you to tell our audiences about this. Artificial intelligence, quantum, outer space, defense technology and transfer, these sort of co-production, all are happening, right? And for a while, we thought that the US was not willing to share technology, and there were a lot of, angst in India that the US has just too many, restrictions and compulsions, and it's not so easy to work with them. But I think slowly we are overcoming those. So do tell us about these frontier areas, and what you've seen, and how they add a new dimension to our strategic partnership.
Yeah, the manufacturing side, I would say, every once in a while triggers a little consternation in the relationship. The Modi government's drive to try to improve local manufacturing, the Make in India program announced a decade ago, trying to get to 25% of GDP in manufacturing by the year 2025. You saw some trade restrictions, some compulsory local manufacturing rules. And on one hand, that caused some irritation, I would say, particularly during the Trump administration, which was very focused on trade relationships. But we do understand, I certainly understand, and I think American policymakers at the top level understand there are dramatic reasons why India has made these drives for domestic manufacturing. You rightly pointed out job creation, critical, as you got a lot of people leaving agriculture, moving to cities. They're not going to move into the high-end IT jobs right away. Having relatively low and middle-skilled employment there. India's trade deficit, this is something I think that's poorly understood by the rest of the world. Both political parties in the United States are relatively anti-trade right now. Our trade deficit is about 2 or 3% of GDP. India is on a bad year, might be 8 to 12% of GDP. Trade
overall with the world.
Yeah, with the world, yeah. So I, and of course we all care a lot more, and this kind of leads to the direct question you asked. We saw during COVID and with rising concerns about over-reliance on China as the workshop for the world, about the security of supply chains as well. China has been actively using sometimes the stranglehold they have on the export of certain technologies as a tool for its own foreign policy rather than treating that purely on a commercial basis. So to the question that you asked, I mean, certainly I'd like to see U.S.-India economic collaboration improve in basic areas, right? India's food processing industry moving up and exporting, creative pipes and basic industries like that. But I think because trade deficits, job creation, and security concerns about China means that at least for the narrow term, we've triangulated on some very important areas. A few years ago, China announced this program, Make in China 2025. Yeah. And I think the areas that highlighted in there have, for understandable reasons, really been the pacing idea in the U.S.-India commercial relationship. As you point out, the United States today is actively cheerleading for American companies in these high-tech areas to consider making investments in the United States. That is extremely rare. There is no other country in the world right now. The United States is mostly focused on trying to reshore investment. India is really just about the only country in the world where you actually have the administration actively encouraging companies to make investments into another market. I mean, think about some of the big domestic laws that we passed that have opened up new money for building semiconductors and renewable energy equipment.
All at home.
All at home.
Yeah.
And yet, again, for India, we've carved out kind of a special place. I mean, look at the joint statement last year when Prime Minister Modi visited the United States, chock full of outbound announcements in areas like semiconductors of encouraging American companies to invest here. I would say to some extent, of course, we want the jobs to be created at home. I think with India, the high-tech areas are following a similar pathway that we see on defense. Defense, if the choice is India continues buying a lot from Russia, or we help India become self-sufficient in defense manufacturing, the second option is preferable. And on high-tech, I would say as well, if it's about India buying this stuff from China versus being better at producing it domestically, the second option is definitely preferable. We'd love for India to buy this stuff from stuff that's produced in the American homeland for sure. But if our best option is actually helping India become self-sufficient producing these things, then I would say the Biden administration has really been all in.
Yeah, so indigenization in critical areas, viewers, what Richard Rossow is saying is that United States is committed to helping India indigenize and to become more self-sufficient in many critical areas, including emerging technologies. And there is a strategic reason for it, even though ideally, from purely commercial point of view, the US may want to sell these to India, but now they are more keen on transfer and co-production because of the looming threat of China. Point well taken. Rick, you have been also studying what's happening at the grassroots in India. You travel a lot to Indian states and engage with local gubernatorial officials, and also try to understand the regulatory environment and all that. Now, India is a big country, and some of the states also do what we call para-diplomacy directly with foreign countries to attract investments. Prime Minister Modi has been encouraging a kind of competitive federalism, as we call it, where the states try to vie with each other to woo and attract more foreign investment. How is that going at the state level with the US? And American companies often bring delegations directly to the states and try to find agreements on the basis of which they can do joint ventures and so on. So how is that going? And please tell our audiences the importance of what is happening at the state level in India.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, state governments are still primarily elected by rural voters, farmers, things like that. Opening up the economy, using a lot of political capital to make dramatic reforms, to make the economy work a bit better in areas like manufacturing and such. For a lot of states, still is not the political priority, which I very much kind of understand. I mean, anybody that's elected to office first has to make sure they're accommodating the people that got them there. But I would say, a few states have managed to kind of break out of that limitation and make some of the reforms in areas that are important. I mean, to your point, if India is going to be a manufacturing powerhouse, most of the keys to get there are not things that are held by New Delhi. Sure, there's some work on foreign investment regulations. India still has dozens of sectors where you've got foreign investment limitations on, things like e-commerce and retail and insurance and lotteries, areas like this. But that's relatively small. Most of the big areas have been opened up already. There's some improvements that can be made to GST, for instance. But a lot of the action has to happen at the state level. Companies look at factors of production. You need to have a reliable way to acquire land without having any kind of concerns about corruption or inefficiency, access to reliable electric power, water, sanitation, labor regulations. And these are areas where I would say still today, a relatively small number of states have prioritized making kind of tough decisions in some of these areas. There are a few, and you see big investments being made right now in some of these high-tech areas, going to places like Gujarat, places like Tamil Nadu, that have done some things to get themselves ready and prepared to land some of those investments. We'd like to see that kind of expand. I spend a lot of time in places like Patna and Bhubaneswar. The last government in Odisha did a big thing on privatizing electric power grids. So there's some smart investment reforms that I think some states have been making. India's a big country, having a few states of 100 million people or 200 million people. These are like countries. So that certainly is helpful to see and have happen there. On competitive federalism, it's tough though, because again, especially now that you're under constraints of a coalition government, you want to make sure that you're not ranking states in ways that put some of the coalition partners in a bad light. So I think some of the competitive federalism issues get a little bit trickier, but we've seen Prime Minister Modi successfully navigate a lot of tricky issues with coalition partners, even when he had to do it in times past there. So I do think this is an exciting opportunity to try to show states how they can become more attractive to investors, try to have states make some of those critical changes in labor regulations, electric power that make them more attractive. And again, as states start to urbanize a little bit more, you have more city residents, they're going to be voting for the same things that companies want to see to make manufacturing investments. So I do think this process will accelerate over time.
Yeah, so viewers, ease of doing business, this India has been making strides, but then India is not a monolith, and we do need to look at what our states are doing, especially vis-a-vis the US. And certainly American companies have some favorites in India in terms of states, and that's because they have certain easier regulatory environment and are more stable and secure for foreign investors. Okay, now switching gears, Rick, it's not only an economic relationship, it's also a thriving military and defense partnership, and also a geopolitical partnership with a clear eye on counterbalancing the Chinese hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. Now, on this count, how would you rate what has happened so far? And people often ask, what can we do together, both on the land borders with the Chinese and in the oceanic expanses, where the US says they are an Indo-Pacific resident power, and they are actively trying to push back the Chinese expansionism and aggression, and India becomes very, very central player there. And we have just signed a new agreement called SOSA, SOSA, to increase defense material sharing and we have signed all the foundational agreements already with the US. We are designated as a major defense partner. Defense is actually probably the number one most happening area in the strategic partnership, isn't it? I mean, or the most talked about one.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that, and if the sky is the limit, what more can we do in this field?
Well, I'm one of the relatively lucky few, I think, that gets to spend part of my day on economic cooperation and part of my day on defense and security. And you're right, at the end of the day, the fact that when you talk about opening up defense relations, the keys to make this happen are almost entirely held by governments, which means that when they make the decision to do things, things happen. On the commercial front, you can liberalize anything you want to, and it still relies completely on whether companies think it's the right moment, the right opportunity to take advantage of it. So on defense, you do have the ability to get important things done when the government sit down at the table, and that was always the case. But over the last 20 years, these critical meetings that are happening on a regular basis have resulted in really tangible things. I would say, from in terms of where the relationship sits today, speaking from the Washington, D.C. perspective, you've got two different audiences that would answer it very differently. One group, people like me that have been working their entire career in India, look at where we were 25 years ago and say, holy cow, how did we get this far along? The complexity and breadth and depth of military exercises, the fact that 25 years ago we had no defense sales, and now some of India's most important platforms on heavy lift and attack helicopters and such are U.S. platforms is amazing.
And drones as well, Predator
drones.
Yeah.
The fact that we have, as you rightly point out, the number of agreements that we've been able to sign, which allow us, the United States, to export some of our most sensitive technology areas, and a few more recent things I'll touch on in just a moment. So if you think about where we were 25 years ago to the India crowd, it feels like we have climbed the mountain already. And then you talk to people that actually have deep experience working in America's most vital relationships, with NATO, with Japan, with Korea, countries like this. And you realize, we feel like we climbed a mountain. We really are just on, maybe the first base camp.
They're way ahead.
Yeah. For an example, is one of my favorite events to host every year or two. One of the top U.S. Army commanders at Indo-Pacific Command, our largest military command, is an Australian general. We have a role set aside for an Australian general at Indo-PACOM to actually, be a senior leader of American troops. Or you talk about, the kind of actions that we've done in the past with partners in some conflicts in the region. There's a whole level of things that I would say you look at and say, this is what the most robust partnerships we have are. So we've come a long way, but there still are other things. But the relationship with India will take a different course than with treaty allies.
Right.
But I would say, to put a finer point, what we've seen just in the last couple of years is a shift away from transfer of technology, of selling things to India, and of exercises, which are all great and they're fundamental, but we are now moving actively into interoperability, which is really the fascinating, the cool stuff. And three things stand out in particular. We all know, and we don't know the entire depths of it, but the United States provided intelligence support, probably material support when China's incursion happened in the mountains a few years ago. We know for sure India joining Combined Maritime Force Bahrain, now actively doing interdictions of illicit shipping in the region in collaboration with the United States and 36 other navies, which is very exciting. India opening up its ports for U.S. Navy vessels to dock for repair and supply work. These are areas when you talk about interoperability, the ability to take action on common interests and common threats and opportunities across the region. This is the real exciting stuff. And none of this was happening, barring some nascent naval cooperation during the 2004 tsunami, which of course was the trigger for the Quad. But now you see the level of complexity and interoperability that's taken off. You set the table by signing agreements, by having similar equipment, by doing exercises. Now we're actually carrying out in practice in ways that we never were.
Yeah, practice and operationalization is the key, viewers. And the point is, India and the United States are in the waters and on land, jointly doing many things to deter our common adversary. And that's a point well taken. Sometimes in India, people become skeptical about whether the US is fully committed and whether the US is playing a double game, etc. But the reality on the ground, you ask our militaries, you ask the state officials who are critical, as Rick Rossow is saying, for the defense partnership, and you can see how far we have come. And It's some people may even call it a de facto alliance, but those are the things that are happening, and it certainly beefs up our security position in the Indian Ocean and in the Indo-Pacific, helps India to project power. Rick, now this partnership has been driven by our leaders, and when there are changes in administration, on the Indian side, of course, this is the 11th year of Narendra Modi administration, and we are almost certain that it will continue for the foreseeable future. On the US side, there's been volatility, like change of turnover of power. Many presidents have come in and gone out, and we will have a new president, whether Democratic or Republican, from 2025. So these changes, how much do you think they affect the overall strategic partnership? And we often say it is bipartisan. We don't worry whether it is Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. But there are some nuances and some changes and shifts that happen, right? So what would be suppose there's whoever comes in, what do you think, continuity with change? I think that's a better way to look at it than just change or just pure continuity, isn't it?
That's a good line. I might borrow that once in a while. I'll make sure I give you credit if I do. I think depending on who wins, you will see some change in what we see in the relationship right now. I think on military cooperation, areas like the Quad, things like that, I do think that it will absolutely be entirely on point. I think we'll stay the course. You saw the Quad expanded when Donald Trump was president the last time. You saw military interoperability and exchanges continue to grow and flower during that period. So I suspect the great pace and trajectory we see on defense ties will be unchanged, whatever happens in the election. I think on commercial is really the area where I think you might see some change. Donald Trump, of course, is very concerned about U.S. trade deficits. You saw him directly going after Prime Minister Modi, even though they had a good, warm, personal relationship. But you saw India oftentimes called out directly by President Trump when he was president about trade restrictions, things like that. So getting back to the point I made before on the Biden administration directly encouraging American companies in strategic technology areas on making investments in India, I think that will be slowed down and curtailed. And some of these lingering issues we have from some of these trade protections we saw adopted in India and some counter protections adopted in the United States, I think that'll rise to the forefront again. So a little more tension on the trade and economic front, but I think things that we can manage, because ultimately, the decision makers closest to the President of the United States, when you talk about commercial relations and defense relations, the upside in defense is strong enough that I don't think they're going to let a little tension on the commercial front wreak havoc in the relationship. So I suspect at the top level, relatively steady, but a little bit of a slowdown on commercial cooperation if Trump comes back to office.
Yeah, so it's a multi-pronged relationship. Viewers, what Rick Rossow is saying is that there's so many aspects from the space, outer space to the seas, as they say. There's so many issue areas on which India and the United States are working together. So one or two points of friction don't mean the whole relationship goes down. It's such a thick strategic partnership that we have built. Rick, it's not only bilateral. Let me take a last word from you on the broader regional cooperation. We are core members of the Quad, and in the Indo-Pacific, there is a test for the Quad because of the kind of bullying and intimidation that we are seeing from the Chinese towards smaller neighboring countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, and so on. So everyone is asking, okay, you have Quad summits and you say we have signed more agreements and we are doing more things together. We have joint exercises, Malabar naval exercises comprising the Quad countries. But then the proof of the pudding, they say, is what is happening on the ground. Are we able to really push back the Chinese, which is our shared strategic goal? Or are we still just posturing and signaling, And at what point do we show that actually the interoperability and all that of all the 4 Quad countries will come together, which becomes like a strong defensive wall that, maybe another island chain, if you like, the first island chain, second, and maybe a third one involving India, which will actually stop the Chinese Navy from expanding, prowling all over the place and, sending their research vessels and submarines and challenging India's domination in our own backyard. So to what extent the Quad and where US and India can drive this forward?
Yeah. So far the Quad has kind of stepped away from being an overt military partnership. And so they focused instead on 2 other critical missions. Number one is, again, trying to make sure that we can work collaboratively so that none of us are too reliant on China for strategic technology areas. So you see Quad work streams in areas of critical minerals, semiconductors, things like that. So that's a commercial function. The second area is what can the Quad members do together to provide goods across the region. So for instance, the vaccine partnership, which probably moved a little bit too slowly during COVID, but it provides, I think, to get those muscles of cooperation working. So the next time you've got some kind of a global health crisis where Japanese money, Indian production, things like that can come together, it's going to be an exciting opportunity. So I would say, getting that muscle memory together in economic cooperation and providing goods to the region, very important steps. On military, you do see with the announcement of the creation of a humanitarian assistance disaster relief working group under the Quad, first responders typically tend to be militaries. So you've got, I think, the first real opportunity where our militaries are starting to work together in a relatively benign area, humanitarian assistance.
Non-traditional security, as they call it. Yeah.
But whether it's going to evolve into something that is more overt security cooperation is yet to be seen. Getting 4 countries to collaborate on this and kind of view China in the same way at the same time is not always easy. There's times when Japan might want to reduce tensions a little bit. Australia right now is probably in that position. Or when you got political flux, which several of the countries have, taking major security decisions can be a little bit more tricky. So it's been, I'd say, slow to articulate what a security vision is going to look like for the Quad. But I expect China remains the pacing threat in terms of what the Quad does. If China continues to put military pressure on India, Philippines, other partners across the region, I suspect that Quad countries are going to be well positioned to start thinking about those roles. So I would say China is the one that's going to define how fast, how quickly, and what roles in a security role the Quad is going to play in the future.
Yeah. So viewers, what Rick Rossow is saying is that many of our bilateral strategic partnership with the US and also the broader Quad and Quad Plus and other formations, all of these to a great extent, how securitized they become also depends on the Chinese actions. And we have clearly indicated to the Chinese that if they do not restrain their excessive use of force and abusing smaller countries, then we reserve the right to push back, right? So I think we are still at the stage where it's definitely not a military alliance, but there is AUKUS and other alliances of which the US is a part of. So there is a security architecture, the lattice work, as the Biden administration calls it, and that will remain in place, and it may become more activated if the Chinese if push comes to shove. So that's the kind of situation we're in. It's been a really enriching conversation with Richard Rossow. I want to thank him for being with us here today. Thank you, Rick, and thank you for the work that you're doing to promote this most seminal relationship. You're one of the few people in the US who we count on as our real friends in India, and we believe that we need unofficial ambassadors like you to cement this relationship and take it to unprecedented heights. Our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, said, "You ain't seen anything yet in the US-India partnership." So while you said, in the last 25 years, it looks like we have climbed the mountain, like you said, maybe we are still only at step 1 or 2, and the horizons are just beckoning. So I want to thank you for this work, and please keep doing this, and you have our fullest support.
Thank you for that. It's a real pleasure to be here. Great questions, and we'll see what happens with the US elections coming up.
Right. So viewers, there may be some shake-up with January 2025 with the new administration in the US taking charge. But the overall story is that this is a linear, progressive success, the India-US strategic partnership over the last almost 25 years. And there are obstacles, but they can be overcome. And that is the sum of this discussion with Richard Rossow. Do think about strategic partnerships and how we can further imbue them with strategic content and strategic operationalization of these partnerships so that they can really shape the region and the world order itself. So thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.